The pen was still warm in my hand when I realized what I'd done. It was 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of unremarkable winter day where the light dies early and the house smells like reheated leftovers and broken promises. And my son Ryan was already walking away from the dining table with the folder tucked under his arm like a hunting trophy. His wife Amanda was clearing the teacups we'd drunk from chamomile that tasted faintly metallic. I remember that no and. She was humming something cheerful while my signature was still drying on documents. I hadn't been allowed to read properly. They told me it was just for protection, that it was standard paperwork so they could help me if I ever got confused. And I believed them because he was my child and I had spent 68 years teaching myself that good mothers trust their sons. But at 2:13 a.m. that same night, my phone lit up with a bank alert that punched the air out of my lungs. Transfer completed, $148,500. I sat up in the freezing dark, my mouth dry as chalk, staring at the screen like it was a death certificate. And I finally understood the monstrous thing they'd been planning all along. They didn't steal my life savings with a gun or a threat. They stole it with my own hand, with tea and fake concern and a pen that clicked too loudly in the silence, and the worst part? The part that still makes my chest tightens, that I let them do it because I was more afraid of being called difficult than I was of being destroyed. The lawyer's voice cracked like ice when he said, "There's a second will." It was 10:22 a.m. on a gray Monday in March. And we were crammed into a conference room that smelled of leather furniture and old coffee. The kind of expensive staleness you only find in law offices where people's lives get dissected on mahogany tables. My brother-in-law Marcus had been dead for exactly 14 days, his body barely cold in the family mausoleum, and already the vultures were circling. My sister Diane sat beside me, rigid as a statue, her black dress still creased from the funeral, and across the table sat Marcus's children from his first marriage, Victoria and James, both in their 40s, both wearing expressions of entitlement so thick you could spread it like butter. The estate attorney, Mr. Whitmore, was gray-haired and soft-spoken in that dangerous way lawyers are when they're about to detonate a bomb. And when he placed the envelope on the table, yellowed, sealed with wax, dated 3 months before, Marcus died, I felt my stomach drop through the floor. Victoria's manicured nails started tapping the table immediately, a nervous rhythm that sounded like a warning. James leaned forward with predatory interest, his expensive cologne cutting through the coffee smell. But it was Diane's face that terrified me, most blank, frozen. As if her mind had already fled to some safer place while her body stayed behind to endure whatever truth was about to shatter everything we thought we knew about the man she'd married 32 years ago. I'm Lillian Hartwell, and I'm 65 years old. Which means I've lived long enough to know that families are held together by careful lies and selective silences. Marcus Hartwell had been the patriarch of our sprawling clan, a self-made commercial real estate developer who built his empire from borrowed money and ruthless ambition. And when he died of a heart attack in his study surrounded by ledgers and whiskey fumes, we all assumed the inheritance would be simple. The first will, drafted 10 years earlier, split everything neatly. Diane got the primary estate, and the beach house, Victoria and James each received trust funds and property shares. And there were provisions for the grandchildren's education. It was fair enough to keep the peace, generous enough to avoid resentment, or so we thought. But that second will, the one Whitmore unsealed with hands that trembled slightly despite his professional composure, revealed that Marcus had been living a double ledger, one for the family we performed at holidays, and one for the truth he'd buried under decades of careful construction. The will was handwritten on Marcus's personal stationery, notarized by a witness none of us recognized. And it began with a sentence that made my blood run cold. To those who read this, know that I built my fortune on foundations I am not proud of, and I die owing debts that money cannot settle. Victoria inhaled sharply. Her tapping stopped. James's jaw clenched so tight I heard his teeth grind. Diane just stared at the table, her breathing shallow. Whitmore cleared his throat and continued reading in that measured lawyer voice that makes even disaster sound bureaucratic. Marcus's revised final instructions restructured everything. The beach house would be sold to fund a restitution account for business partners Marcus had defrauded in the 1990s. The primary estate would be placed in a trust managed by an independent fiduciary, and specific sums would be allocated to parties wronged by my silence. Then came the devastating paragraph that split our family like an axe through rotten wood. Marcus acknowledged that Victoria and James's mother, Catherine, had never received her fair share in the divorce settlement because Marcus had hidden assets deliberately, and he was now directing that they received double their original inheritance as belated justice. But the cruelest detail was saved for last. Marcus confessed that the seed money for his first major deal, the investment that launched his empire, had been embezzled from Diane's father's company, where Marcus had worked as a junior accountant in 1981. And he instructed that Diane's inheritance be reduced proportionally to reflect what was never rightfully mine to give her. The room erupted. Victoria stood so quickly, her chair screeched against the floor, and she started laughing, harsh, vindicating sound that had nothing to do with humor. "I knew it," she hissed, her voice thick with decades of suppressed rage. "I knew he was a fraud. I knew he destroyed my mother with lies." James was already on his phone, presumably calling his own attorney, his face flushed with greedy satisfaction. But Diane didn't move. She sat frozen, her hands folded in her lap. I watched her face cycle through shock, humiliation, and a kind of collapse that happens when the story you've lived inside turns out to be fiction. She had spent 3 decades as Marcus Hartwell's devoted wife, the elegant hostess at charity galas, the woman who defended him against every accusation of ruthlessness by saying he was just ambitious, just driven, just misunderstood. And now, in a conference room that smelled like old coffee and betrayal, she learned that her entire marriage had been subsidized by theft, that her beautiful life had been built on money stolen from her own father, and that Marcus had carried that secret to his grave like a coward. I reached for Diane's hand, but she pulled away. "Don't," she whispered, and her voice was so broken it barely registered as sound. Victoria leaned across the table, her earlier laugh gone, replaced by something sharper and meaner. "You lived like a queen on stolen money," she said to Diane, each word carefully aimed. "Everything you wore, every vacation you took, every time you looked down on us because Dad chose you, it was all built on lies. How does that feel, Aunt Diane? Does it feel like justice?" I wanted to defend my sister, to stand up and shout that she had been a victim too, that Marcus's secrets weren't her crimes, but the truth was more complicated than that. Diane had ignored warning signs for years, the late-night phone calls Marcus took in his study, the business deals that didn't quite add up, the way he always paid for things in cash when it came to certain transactions. She hadn't asked questions because asking questions would have shattered the illusion, and the illusion was comfortable. We left the lawyer's office that day with our family in ruins. The legal battle that followed was vicious and public, the kind that gets covered in society pages with gleeful cruelty because people love watching the wealthy destroy each other. Victoria and James hired a litigation firm known for scorched earth tactics, and they went after every asset with forensic precision, demanding full disclosure of every account, every property, every investment Marcus had ever touched. They filed motions to freeze Diane's access to shared accounts, arguing she had been complicit in the fraud through willful ignorance. The local newspaper ran a feature titled, "The Hartwell Empire's Rotten Foundation," complete with interviews from former business associates who gleefully detailed Marcus's shady dealings. Diane stopped leaving the house. She stopped answering calls. She moved through the rooms of the estate like a ghost haunting her own life. And I moved in with her because I was terrified she would do something irreversible. One night, 3 weeks into the legal war, I found her in Marcus's study at 2 a.m., surrounded by his old files, ledgers spread across the floor like evidence at a crime scene. She had been drinking. There was an open bottle of scotch on the desk, the same brand Marcus used to drink. Her eyes were red-rimmed and distant. "I found more," she said without looking at me, her voice flat. I found the contracts he forged, the partnerships he dissolved by lying, the people he bankrupted. She held up a folder with a trembling hand. There's a woman in Nevada who lost her family business because Marcus convinced her to sign documents she didn't understand. There's a man in Florida who went to prison for fraud that Marcus committed and blamed on him. I've been married to a monster, Lillian. I slept beside him for 32 years and I never knew. I sat down on the floor beside her, my old knees protesting, and I took the folder from her hands. Diane, this wasn't your fault. You didn't know, but I could have, she whispered. If I'd asked the right questions, if I'd been brave instead of comfortable. That's when I realized the inheritance battle wasn't really about money. It was about narrative, about who got to control the story of Marcus Hartwell's life. Victoria and James wanted to rewrite him as a villain who stole from their mother and destroyed lives. Diane wanted to cling to the belief that some part of their marriage had been real. And I was caught in the middle, watching both versions collapse under the weight of evidence. The hidden documents Diane found became the turning point. She could have destroyed them. She could have hidden them the way Marcus had hidden so many things. But instead, she did something that surprised everyone, including me. She handed them over to the attorneys, all of them. Both sides, and she made a statement in court that was raw and devastating. I will not protect a dead man's lies, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. If Marcus stole, if Marcus lied, if Marcus destroyed lives to build his fortune, then the truth matters more than my comfort. She agreed to the restitution payments. She agreed to reduce her inheritance. She agreed to cooperate with investigations into Marcus's business practices, even though it meant her name would be dragged through public humiliation. Victoria and James were stunned into silence. They had expected Diane to fight, to protect her assets, to become the villain they needed her to be. But by surrendering to the truth, she took away their narrative weapon. The court battles shifted. Instead of Diane versus the children, it became a collective reckoning with Marcus's legacy. Properties were sold, restitution accounts were funded, victims of Marcus's fraud were contacted and compensated. It took 18 months, and by the end of it, the Hartwell fortune was a fraction of what it had been, but at least it wasn't poisoned anymore. Diane lives quietly now in a modest townhouse near the coast, far from the estate that held too many lies. She volunteers at a legal aid clinic, helping people navigate paperwork and understand contracts, perhaps her way of atoning for the documents she never questioned when it would have mattered. We have lunch every Sunday, and sometimes she talks about Marcus with a kind of weary clarity, acknowledging both the man she loved and the criminal he was. Victoria and James received their settlement and disappeared back to their own lives. Their vindication complete, but somehow unsatisfying because revenge doesn't heal the wound. It just makes you familiar with the shape of it. I think about that sealed envelope often, about how Marcus chose to confess only after death. When he couldn't face the consequences of his own truth, it was cowardice dressed as conscience. And I think about what Victoria said in that first terrible meeting. How does it feel? She asked it like a weapon, but it's actually the question that matters most. How does it feel to discover your life was subsidized by theft? How does it feel to realize you love someone who is capable of monstrous things? How does it feel to inherit not wealth, but reckoning? It feels like standing in the ruins of a house you thought was solid and realizing the foundation was sand all along. It feels like betrayal that outlives the betrayer. It feels like the loneliest kind of freedom, finally knowing the truth, but wishing desperately that you didn't. There's no peace in this ending, no neat resolution where justice makes everything right. The money was redistributed. The victims were compensated. The family name was stained beyond repair. But the questions remain. How many other sealed envelopes are hidden in studies and safe deposit boxes waiting to detonate long after the liar is gone? How many families are held together by secrets that would destroy them if spoken aloud? And what do you do when you discover that the person you built your life around was never the person you thought they were? I don't have answers. I only have what I witnessed. A family torn apart not by the inheritance itself, but by the truth that came with it. Marcus Hartwell died believing he could control his legacy from beyond the grave, but the dead don't get to write the final chapter. The living do. And sometimes the most courageous thing the living can do is refuse to protect the lies that outlive the liar. Diane said something to me last Sunday while we were drinking coffee and watching the ocean through her townhouse window. I grieve to deaths now, she said quietly. The man I thought I married and the man who actually existed. Both are gone. Both left me with nothing but questions. That's the real inheritance. Not the money or the property or the bloodline. It's the questions. The ones that keep you awake at 2 a.m., sorting through old ledgers, trying to find the exact moment the person you loved became the person you never knew at all.